I really don't put out fires. I have 7 department heads who are my chief firemen. They put out fires.
Craig, I'm going to pass this over to you. Super excited that we hopefully have a good internet connection, and now we're ready to take notes on every sentence you say on how to delegate casework.
Thanks so much, Bill. I do about 60% automobile cases, 30% premises cases. Slip and fall law is pretty good here in Florida. So I just wanted to give a breakdown for what types of law I do for your listeners, so they know who I am. The rest is medical malpractice, nursing home neglect, etc. So it's 100% personal injury. And I started my firm, Bill, back in 2002. So that's about 19 years ago. And I started with me and Debbie, 2 people. Debbie did everything else, and I was the one lawyer. So Debbie retired about 6 months ago, and I'm still here. But now we're up to almost 80 employees, and I think yesterday I put an offer in for my 11th lawyer, and we grow, I think, about 18% per year for the last 20 years. So that's pretty damn good. And as you put in your little promotional email, I now am multiple 8 figures in fees that I generate every single year. So I started out little guy solo, and now I'm not. So how did I do that? Well, gosh, I think one way I did that, and that's the topic of today's talk, is delegation. And delegation is scary. It's really scary because there's so many psychological factors that go into delegation. And one of the first distinctions I wanted to draw in delegation is it creates a question about your identity. And what I mean by that is that some people define themselves as a technician, which means they're a lawyer. Some people define themselves as an entrepreneur, which is as a business owner. Bill, you speak about this almost every seminar you give. Now, the question is, do you have to be one or the other? And the answer is no, you don't. You can be both. And the analogy I use is a plumber. A plumber can like being a plumber and fixing toilets, or a plumber can own a plumbing company. Now, when you own a plumbing company, you may not be going out there and fixing toilets anymore, but you may really like toilets. You may love fixing toilets. So the question is, where do you place yourself on the spectrum? Well, I know I'm on the spectrum, but where do you place yourself on the spectrum of technician, i.e. plumber, versus entrepreneur, which is plumbing company owner? Now, me, myself, I want to be 100% owner. I'm done with being a lawyer. I was done being with a lawyer about 10 to 15 years ago. Didn't want to be a plumber anymore, hypothetically. Wanted to be a business owner. There's a lot of people who want to be in the middle. They want to do some law and some business because they really enjoy the clients. They really enjoy the practice of law, but they like the business stuff too. So when it comes to delegating, you have to decide where do you want to be on that spectrum. And I decided where I want to be, which requires 100% delegation. 100% delegation. I've got to delegate everything except the highest level of tasks because I have 80 people. So that's the first thing. Define yourself. Where do you want to be, technician or entrepreneur? And if it's somewhere in the middle, that determines your level of delegation you got to do. So that's your first thing, is make that determination. Next is, well, why delegate? I mean, why delegate at all? Well, because your time is limited, of course. I mean, that's pretty obvious that your time is limited, but that's a reason, because you can't do everything, even if you're one person. So if we did everything, we'd never stop working and we never see our family. So it's kind of a basic, like, common sense. Your time is limited. The next is it really affects your stress. I mean, if you do everything, you're putting out fires all day, you're a fireman. And I know that if I asked people, if we were in a live seminar right now, and I said, how many people feel they're putting out fires all day? Probably about 75% of the room usually raises their hand. Well, I'm honored and happy to say that I have no fires in my office. Now, nobody believes me when I say that. But I really don't put out fires. I have 7 department heads who are my chief firemen. They put out fires. When COVID hit, my 7 department heads, March 13th, 2020, I was waiting for them to determine their firefighting strategy. And about 4 hours later, they said, Craig, we're ready for you. Instead of running in my office, they said, we're ready for you. And I said, ready for what? And they said, ready to tell you our plan. There was no fire. There was their plan to put out all the fires that COVID caused. That's pretty damn cool. That I didn't have to put out the fire. I had 7 chief of fire departments that said, we're ready for you. So that's because I've delegated authority. I've delegated productivity. I've delegated plan making authority to 7 people in my office. That to me is amazing that I don't have to put out fires. And the most important reason to delegate, the most important, is you cannot grow your business, whether it's size of staff, profits, you can't scale, you can't do anything you want to do unless you delegate. So I hope that answers the questions, why delegate?
The next part is the roadblocks, and I'm really interested to hear, this killing the hero complex. I interviewed someone named Brad Sugars, who is the founder of Action Coach. He has 7,000 employees, and he said he called this superhero-itis. Where the CEO has to be the superhero and come in and save the day and have all these strategies. So what do you think are the real roadblocks for someone who hasn't delegated casework for too long, maybe a decade, maybe 5 years? What are the roadblocks?
Sure. There are a lot of roadblocks, and I'd say that most of them are psychological, to be honest. And they all revolve around identity. So one of the first is trust. And with trust, the issue is that you haven't hired the right people, or you haven't trained them correctly to earn your trust. The second is that you think you can do it the best. If I said, who thinks you can do everything at your law firm better than anybody else, you would all raise your hand. Well, let me challenge that assumption, because you're only right in about 5% of that situation. You may be best at doing some of the legal work. You are absolutely not the best at doing intakes, even though you think you're a master at empathy, you're a master of getting facts, you're a master of doing an intake, and you're a master of closing the deal. I would say wrong, 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 wrong. I don't have any lawyers doing intakes, and one of the reasons is because we're in a hurry. Your intake people are not. One of the reasons is that we're lawyers. We're kind of assholes, and we want to get to the facts because we need to know about the insurance on the other side. We need to know the date of the accident. That's not what they want to tell us. They want to say, my leg's broken, I'm in a lot of pain. How am I going to get to work? They want empathy. We're not good at empathy. If I asked you how many guys are you good at empathy, they teach in law school, and people with empathy do not get attracted to be lawyers. Sorry. So guess what? I've had to train empathy into myself, and I've also had to train intake people. I hire the nicest people to be an intake. There's these cool millennials that say things like, that sounds awful. You know, when you're treating your spouse or your husband and they're complaining, don't solve their problem. Say, that sounds awful. 3 best words to keep you married. That sounds horrible, right? I've stayed married because those 3 words I say about 10 times a day to my wife. That sounds awful, honey. So those are the type of people you need in intake, right? Don't solve people's problems. Don't tell them how great a lawyer you are. Your intake people are trained to say, that sounds awful, or you've chosen the right law firm. Those are words of reassurance. So if you think that you can do everything better than everybody else, sorry, you're wrong. You can do about 5% of the things in your law firm better than anybody else. So you got to get rid of that I'm the best theory that you learned when you were 5 and you were put in gifted. The first time you were told you were gifted. Well, since that day you've been told how great you are. Well, guess what? You're not. I have 80 people at my law firm who are better than me at certain things, and I just need to get out of their way. So the first is your lack of trust. The second is your belief that you can do it better than everybody else. The third is your type A and or OCD personality. That's another block to delegation, is that you want to hold on to things. And this all, if you sum it up into one big package of garbage, it's called a hero complex. And that's what Bill was talking about. It's one big package of bullshit, which is that you have a hero complex, that you want to save the world, and that the only way you can do it is being involved in everything and micromanaging everything, which means you cannot delegate. So when you think of a hero, you might think of an Avenger, and most Avengers have capes, right? So in order to get rid of the hero complex, I call it removing the cape. You got to take off your cape or cut your hair if you're Thor, and become fat Thor in, what was it, Avengers Endgame, where he was fat Thor and was drunk all the time. So you got to become fat Thor and take off your cape, I guess. Wow, that's the first time I use that analogy. I like it. And you got to take off your cape, which means that you have to change your identity a little bit. You are not the end all be all. An example I like is that I went to Duke for undergrad in North Carolina, and there's a wonderful coach of the Duke basketball team that you all may have heard of, best coach in history. His name's Coach K, Coach Krzyzewski. And he had a heart attack about 10 years ago. And when he had his heart attack, he wrote a book and some very great promotional or some coaching CDs, which, you know, back 10 years ago, we still had CDs. So my wife got me the CDs, and he talked about when he had a heart attack, it's because he was the hub of the wheel of Duke basketball. So he was the center of everything, and every decision had to go through him. So because every decision had to go through him, he worked 80 hours a week. That caused him to have a heart attack because everything had to go through him. Why? He had his Coach K cape on. He was the hero of Duke basketball. And you notice after that, if you ever watch basketball, he now has 6 assistant coaches. 6. Because what he decided to do with the wheel of Duke basketball is he made 6 hubs, basically departments of his basketball coaching empire. So what I did at my office is the same thing. It's like a corporation. You cannot be the one hub at the middle of your whole law firm that every spoke goes into. You can't do that. Why? You'll have a heart attack, and you also won't be able to grow your program. So Coach K learned. He learned from his heart attack that he could not be the hub. So in order to take off your hero complex, you have to decentralize command. And let me repeat that. You have to decentralize command and take off your hero complex. I have 7 hubs, 7 departments, and they're the only people who report to me. So I am still at the highest level of decision making, but I have 7 different people who report to me who are the heroes of their own departments. And now we're going to move on to, okay, well, you told me why I suck and why I can't delegate. So let's talk about, well, how do you overcome these blocks? Great. So how do you overcome these blocks? Well, the first is actually kind of some soul searching, which is realize that the impact that this is having on you, the impact. And this is something that you kind of got to sit with. Your health is failing. You're stressed out. You're not sleeping. You're not earning enough money. You're putting out fires. Your spouse is pissed that you're working too much. You might have little kids that you're not spending enough time with, and you're going to die of a heart attack. Now, if I didn't hit you with some reality just then, maybe you should replay this because it's probably being taped and listen to those 5 or 6 things I just mentioned. If those don't make you a little bit concerned, well, then you're not getting the impact of what not delegating is doing to you in your life. Those are some real down-to-earth things that are caused by your failure to delegate. And if you want to add one more thing, is you're not making enough money and you're not growing, which is kind of the point of Bill's broadcast here. So, you know, first is realize the impact. So really sit with the fact that you're not happy. The second is a couple of tools I want to give you. One is a phrase that I use. It's called delegate to the lowest level of competence. And if you're not writing this down, write it down, put a little sticky on your computer, or for those of you that are millennials, type it in some app of some sort or your notes app in your phone. I use stickies because I'm an old man, but put it down somewhere. Delegate to the lowest level of competence. What that means is delegate something down to the employee who is at the lowest level, who's paid the least amount of money, that can do it competently, such as opening the mail, right? So opening the mail, do you delegate that to your department head? No, that's not the lowest level of competence. You delegate it to your receptionist, perhaps, because that's the lowest paid person in your office who can do it competently. Now remember the competently part, because you don't delegate high-level decisions to your receptionist. But lowest level of competence, that's tool number one. Tool number two is what, there's in the business world, there's like 10 different times you've heard the term the 80-20 principle. It applies to so many areas of business, but it's, again, I'm going to use it again in delegation. It's the 80-20 principle, which is if someone lower can do it 80% as well as you, or the person who needs to delegate it, you must delegate it. So not only the lowest level of competence, but the lowest level of 80% competence. That's important. And for type A OCD folks like me, that's really hard. That goes into the trust thing. That goes into the hero thing. Because darn it, I don't want to put out anything that's only 80% as good as I would do it.